The elevator stalled between floors with a soft, wounded groan, the kind of sound that makes your heart leap into your throat before your mind can catch up. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, bathing the glass walls in a pale glow that made the city outside look distant and unreal. In that suspended moment, a single father who had learned to keep his eyes on the ground felt the weight of a life he never planned pressing against his ribs, and a powerful CEO who was used to answers felt the unfamiliar ache of being avoided by the one person she could not seem to reach. Sometimes, the smallest pauses in a rushing world become the doorway to everything we've been running from. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet power of human connection, take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the Kindness Chronicles. Your support helps these stories reach the hearts that need them most. For months, he had mastered the art of invisibility in a building made of glass. Every morning, the single dad timed his arrival to slip in just after the CEO's car passed the gates, and every evening, he lingered at his desk until the executive floors dimmed, so the corridors felt empty enough to walk through without bracing for her presence. His name was Daniel Reyes, and the badge clipped to his belt said Senior Data Analyst, but the title meant little compared to the invisible title he carried in his chest. Father to a 6-year-old girl who still believed her dad could fix anything as long as he was willing to try. His life had become a careful choreography of daycare pickups, late-night report revisions, packed lunches, and quiet apologies to an empty apartment for not being more than one person. The company's success story had once promised him stability, a steady paycheck, and a ladder to climb, but stability had turned into survival, and the ladder felt like a wall he pressed against without knowing how to scale. In the halls of polished marble and brushed steel, Daniel walked with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that being noticed was not always safe, that attention could bring questions he wasn't ready to answer, and that sometimes, the cost of being seen was more than he could afford to pay. The CEO, Evelyn Hart, was a woman whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines, but whose presence in the building was quieter than the rumors suggested. She arrived early, left late, and moved through the company like a tide that reshaped everything it touched. Her success had been built on clarity, on seeing what others missed, on asking the questions no one wanted to hear, and it was that clarity that had fixed on Daniel with an unsettling intensity. She had noticed the way his reports carried a precision that felt personal, the way his recommendations were both cautious and brave, the way he seemed to shrink from praise even when it was deserved. In meetings, she had caught him lowering his gaze just as she lifted hers, as if eye contact itself were a fragile thing that might break if held too long. It wasn't attraction in the careless sense people liked to whisper about. It was recognition, the quiet click of two wounded instincts noticing each other in a room full of polished ambition. She had asked for his insights, invited him to project briefings, and made space for his voice, only to feel it slip away as soon as it began to form. Avoidance, she realized, was not indifference, it was a language of fear, and it unsettled her because she recognized it too well. Daniel's fear was older than the building, older than the job that paid for groceries and school shoes. It was born in a hospital room years ago, where the beeping of machines had become the soundtrack to his life as he held his wife's hand and watched her slip further away with each shallow breath. He had learned, in that fluorescent-lit limbo, that promises could shatter quietly, that love could leave you with more responsibility than you knew how to carry, and that grief did not always roar. Sometimes it settled in like dust, coating every surface until the world looked the same but felt heavier. When his daughter, Sophia, had arrived into a silence that should have been filled with celebration, Daniel had made a vow not to break again in front of anyone who depended on him. He had learned to pack his pain neatly into corners, to keep it from spilling into conversations, to avoid places where someone might notice the cracks in his careful composure. The CEO's attention felt like a light too bright, a spotlight that might reveal the fragile scaffolding holding him together. Avoiding her became less about her and more about protecting the small, fierce world he had built for himself and his child. Evelyn's own history had taught her that people did not pull away without reason. She had grown up in rooms where success was a currency traded for affection, where failure meant silence, and where vulnerability was treated like a flaw to be corrected. Becoming the youngest CEO in the company's history had been a triumph shaped by relentless discipline, but it had also been a shield she learned to wear without noticing its weight. The more she achieved, the lonelier her victories felt, and the more she found herself drawn to people who carried their struggles quietly. Daniel's avoidance had begun to feel personal, not because she demanded attention, but because she sensed something human slipping through the cracks of her controlled world. She did not want to conquer his distance, she wanted to understand it, to see the story behind the careful steps he took to keep his space intact. In a company built on metrics and margins, she felt an unfamiliar urge to make room for something less measurable, something like compassion. The elevator's sudden pause became the moment when their carefully maintained distances collided. Trapped in the glass box between floors, with the city suspended around them like a painting, Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to retreat having nowhere to go. The silence stretched, not awkward but heavy, filled with the hum of cables and the quiet presence of two lives intersecting against their will. Evelyn, accustomed to addressing problems head-on, felt the rare uncertainty of not knowing where to begin. The words that finally rose in her were not sharp or strategic. They were simple, human, and trembling with the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. She asked him why he was avoiding her, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to step into the truth they both felt pressing against the walls of that suspended moment. His answer did not come easily, and when it did, it was not the polished explanation he might have offered in a meeting room. It was the truth he had been holding back from the world, the truth that said he avoided her because being seen by someone who noticed him so clearly made him afraid of being known for more than his output. He spoke of the way his life had narrowed to the shape of responsibility, of the fear that opening himself to another person's expectations might leave him failing at the one role he could not afford to fail, of the grief that still whispered to him in the quiet hours and told him that attachment was a risk he no longer knew how to take. In that small, humming space, his carefully constructed invisibility cracked, and what spilled through was not weakness but honesty, raw and unguarded. The words changed the air between them, softening the sharp edges of misunderstanding into something gentler, something like recognition. Evelyn listened without interrupting, the practiced discipline of leadership giving way to the deeper discipline of presence. She heard in his words the echo of her own unspoken fears, the way success had taught her to guard her heart as fiercely as her company's future. In his vulnerability, she saw not an employee struggling to keep up, but a father carrying a world on his shoulders, a man who had learned to survive by making himself small in rooms that demanded size. The realization shifted something in her, loosening the grip of assumptions she had held about strength and ambition. She did not offer solutions or platitudes, she offered space, the rarest gift in a world that demanded constant motion. When the elevator shuddered back to life and the doors opened onto a familiar floor, the moment they stepped into was not the same one they had left behind. Something had changed, subtle but profound, like the quiet click of a lock turning open. In the days that followed, Daniel found that the building felt different. The corridors no longer pressed in on him with the same weight, and the glass walls reflected a man who looked slightly less burdened by his own invisibility. Evelyn did not single him out or elevate him beyond his role. Instead, she adjusted the environment around him, encouraging flexible hours, acknowledging the invisible labor of caregiving in a culture that often ignored it, and creating spaces where people could bring more of themselves to work without fear of judgment. Daniel began to notice the small ways this shift rippled outward, the way colleagues seemed less hurried to hide their struggles, the way empathy began to take root in a place that had long prized performance above all else. At home, Sophia noticed the change too, in the lighter way her father laughed at her stories, in the way his shoulders no longer seemed permanently hunched under the weight of invisible expectations. The world had not become easier, but it had become kinder in small, meaningful ways, and that made the struggle feel less lonely. The transformation was not a fairy tale of instant healing or effortless success. Daniel still woke to the ache of memory, still wrestled with the exhaustion of balancing work and parenthood, still felt the pull of fear when vulnerability crept too close. Evelyn still faced the relentless pressures of leadership, the scrutiny of decisions, the loneliness that accompanied authority. But between them had formed an understanding that did not demand more than either could give. It was a quiet alliance built on respect, on the shared recognition that strength did not mean standing alone, and that leadership could look like listening as much as commanding. The building, once a monument to glass and steel ambition, began to feel like a place where human stories were allowed to breathe, where people were not just roles moving through space but lives intersecting in fragile, powerful ways. As the seasons shifted and the city outside the glass walls changed its colors, Daniel found himself standing a little taller, not because his burdens had vanished, but because he no longer felt he had to carry them unseen. The CEO's question had opened a door he hadn't known he was allowed to walk through, a door that led not to romance or rescue, but to something steadier and more enduring, the permission to be human in a world that often asked him to be more than that. And Evelyn, in witnessing his courage to speak the truth he had hidden for so long, found her own understanding of leadership reshaped, grounded less in control and more in connection. Their lives continued, imperfect and complex, but threaded now with a shared reminder that sometimes, the most powerful changes begin with a simple question asked in an ordinary moment. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet battles people fight behind their everyday smiles, take a moment to let that feeling ripple outward. Like the video, share it with someone who might need a reminder that they're not alone, and subscribe to the Kindness Chronicles so these stories of hope and second chances can keep finding their way to hearts that need them. And before you go, leave a comment about the line or moment that touched you most. Your words might be the